Nationalism, then, had other somewhat more sinister roots, and at the period of German and Italian unification, there arose a set of ideas that would inform nationalist rhetoric. As I discussed in my first lecture for this course, European civilization is driven by ideas as much as events, and these ideas became the platforms in which Europeans constructed their political, economic, social, and cultural institutions. I also suggested that to understand the history of the continent fully, it's necessary to see these things and these conditions not in a purely linear way, but rather as tesserae in a mosaic, which when assembled provide a clear representation of the shape and civilization of a continent. For we're in fact talking about a complex civilization, a composite of all the elements that form a modern society, reflected in a set of attitudes, some shared, some exclusive, but nevertheless all European in their roots and manifestation. It is this mosaic that our course is about, and to grasp the complexity of the civilization of a continent as rich in history and ideas as Europe, each one of these tesserae must be assessed. Many of them moved outside the confines of Europe in order to inform Western civilization as a whole, and through European expansion and the universal acceptance of certain principles, such as the primacy of science and reason, to inform the entire globe. The story is not only complicated, but it's also challenging. Challenging to many observers even today, inasmuch as concepts like progress, community, responsibility, freedom, and democracy are not absolute terms, but relative ones, applicable to different places in different ways. And many of these ideas are still challenging because they represent cultural revolutions and upheavals that began in Europe and then were largely settled on that continent, whereas they are still points of contention in other places where different values obtain and different political and belief systems operate. This is particularly evident in the role of science, and particularly evident in the set of ideas that have become collectively known as Darwinism. As we've seen, the middle classes were ascendant by the middle of the 19th century. Their values, principles, and positions seemed to be driving the agendas of most industrialized European nations. They were confident, optimistic, secure, happy in their belief that all was well and would only get better. There were challenges from below in the growing solidarity of the industrial working class movements and, as we'll see, in the formation of socialist political parties. Equally, there were challenges from above, such as the conservative attempt to slow, if not stop, progress in the political and social spheres. However, there was another kind of challenge, made about the same time, a challenge that was not bred from oppression, exploitation, or reaction, but from the very roots of middle-class self-confidence itself, and that is from science. The crystallization of the challenge was the work of Charles Darwin, and the message found in his monumental work on the origin of species, produced in 1859, in many respects represents, in fact, the formation of a line of bifurcation. The mind of Europe can be seen to be divided into pre- and post-Darwinian segments. The impact of the work was that significant. Science and technology had established a system of thought and a method for solving problems that had resulted in the huge and obvious economic, social, and political advances of the 19th century. The idea of rejecting or renouncing these advances was now, in fact, an impossibility, and scientists had become the new heroes of an age of progress. Pasteur and Koch, for example, as we've seen, in identifying the causes of infectious disease, reduced the high incidence of child mortality and early death. Science, then, was a salvation for humanity, and no reasonable person could reject it, despite Pius IX's attempt in the Syllabus of Errors. But then came the publication of On the Origin of Species, with a message that exploded like a bomb concealed in a prayer book: evolution. And the impact of Charles Darwin on the 19th century in Europe was seismic. It was revolutionary in the extreme, so powerful that it created that line, dividing the continent into two parts: those who were willing and eager to accept it and to use it to explain all sorts of issues and problems, and those who were forced, for reasons of faith or comfort, to reject it. Darwin, moreover, was an honored and meticulous scientist whose theories were based upon thousands and thousands of observations and on scientific reasoning of the highest order. But his theories undermined the very foundations of religion and traditional thought, things that had really given European civilization its character, part of the foundations of that civilization, things that had been assumed, the very vocabulary of dealing with the world had been part of this belief system. Now, Darwin was suggesting that, in fact, it may all have been wrong. While Newton, in the scientific revolution, may have relegated God to the role of the giant engineer, the great clockmaker who set the universe ticking, Newton's God remained in place. He was the first cause of all things, the primum mobile. But Darwin could not seem to find a place for God at all. Rather, he concluded that the universe was not dependent upon a single ordering principle, but was subject to a number of different forces: climate, breeding, chance, strength, weakness. God was nowhere to be found, and creation then was simply a fable. Taking this to its ultimate extent then, man had the power to change his environment and even himself, with no reference to absolutes except those of science, or perhaps the demands of social expediency. The theory of evolution isn't really new at all. In fact, it had circulated from classical times in very imprecise, often metaphorical ways. The Enlightenment interest in science had resurrected the idea that all species change over time, depending on their environment. Darwin was indebted to and acknowledged many of these influences, including the 18th century French naturalist, the Comte de Buffon, whom we met earlier as a contributor to Diderot's Encyclopedia in matters of natural science, the Swede Carl Linnaeus, after whose taxonomy the Linnaean system of classification is named, and particularly the Frenchman Jean de Lamarck, who developed a coherent evolutionary theory in several important texts published in the early decades of the 19th century. In particular, Lamarck argued that when the environment changes, animals in that environment are forced to change their habits, and over time, these changed habits lead to structural changes. The contribution of Darwin, however, was the critical scientific element. He provided solid scientific proof that species change over time, and more significantly, explained again, using evidence, how and why they changed. Charles Darwin was a remarkable man and not in the least bit the character to lead a revolution. He was born into a wealthy intellectual family. He was the son and grandson of celebrated physicians. His grandfather, Erasmus Darwin, was one of the leading scientific lights of his age, who even produced a treatise in 1794 on evolutionary principles called the Zoonomia, or the Laws of Organic Life. Charles himself started by studying medicine, the family profession, but he couldn't tolerate the sight of blood. So he shifted his interest to natural science. After graduating from Cambridge, he was given the kind of opportunity that very, very few young scholars just graduated from university could ever imagine. Through the intercession of one of his mentors at Cambridge who recognized his ability and his thoroughness, and also the fact that he didn't need to work for a living, he was offered the position as official scientist for a 5-year voyage aboard the HMS Beagle. This voyage would give him the opportunity to read, but more so, to collect specimens as the ship progressed across the Atlantic into the Pacific Ocean on its around-the-world voyage. As everyone knows, he collected scientific specimens from sparsely inhabited places. He went to little visited places on Earth. He went to small islands off the coast of continents so he could see the small changes that species demonstrate as they move in just relatively short distances. For example, on the Galapagos Islands, he was able to provide powerful evidence that species in fact change depending on their environment. This opportunity allowed him to trace then small variations in species, allowed him to obtain scientific evidence completely unavailable to Lamarck and Buffon. These scientists had been thinking only in the abstract. Now Darwin, in fact, was thinking as a practical field scholar. Darwin was also thinking in broader terms. He wanted not just to classify his specimens. He didn't just want to indicate that something was happening. He was interested in determining why things happened. He was, after all, a scientist. On the Beagle, he had long periods of leisure. There's something about a 5-year voyage on a sailing ship around the world that provides a great deal of time to read. And he did. He read widely. He noted, for example, that his theory of natural selection was partly inspired by his critique of Thomas Malthus's essay on the principle of population, a book that we've met before in our discussion of David Ricardo. When Darwin returned home, he worked diligently on this data. He recorded this data in his travels and he tried to make sense of it. He tried to interpret it in a way that would provide an overarching theory that would explain why he saw the changes and the variations that he did. But even after reaching some conclusions, he chose not to publish immediately because he was an extraordinarily sensitive man. He realized the implications of his conclusions, and his personality was not suited to confrontation or acrimony. There's been a good deal written about Darwin's personality, in particular his physical state. He was diagnosed as having that 19th century disease called neurasthenia, which is really nothing except being tired all the time and somewhat distracted, which could be said of almost most scholars. He also was married to his first cousin to keep the family fortune intact, and he spent much of his day lying on a sofa listening to his wife play the piano. He was always weak and sick. He was a doting and devoted father, and one of the great emotional moments in his life was the death of his young daughter, Annie. Still, he was forced to publish. He was forced to begin a battle that he would have preferred not actually to have fought. He was forced to publish in 1859 the results of his work in On the Origin of Species. And this was because a fellow naturalist, Alfred Russel Wallace, had also proposed a similar theory on the evolution of animals in a paper on the law which has regulated the introduction of species of 1859 that Russel Wallace sent to the Royal Society for consideration. Darwin, neurasthenic though he was still a man who had some pride in his own conclusions and also knew that he was the one who came up with this evidence first. So he wasn't content to see his conclusions appropriated by another. He saw the need to finally publish the material that he'd been collecting, organizing, contemplating since those 5 years on the Beagle. Wallace and Darwin had reached exactly the same conclusions, both of them based on extensive field work. Darwin had reached his conclusions first, and it was only his reticence to publish that resulted in the late appearance of his revolutionary book On the Origin of Species. In fact, if Darwin had chosen not to publish, we wouldn't be talking about Darwinism today. We'd be talking about Wallaceism. But what made Darwin's work so revolutionary? Why was it this seismic explosion? Why was it this dividing line in the entire European experience and imagination? Why was it seen as so revolutionary that, in fact, we still speak of pre-Darwinian thought and post-Darwinian thought? Well, to some extent, it helped define the European experience itself. And partly it was revolutionary because, although written by a scientist, it was not only written for other scientists. It was written in a way that could be understood by laymen. Its arguments easily transmitted to popular publications such as newspapers and journals, and also to natural history museums, which were growing in popularity as we saw, reflecting middle-class interest in culture and knowledge. As more and more members of the middle class became attracted to a general interest in science as part of the culture of being educated, they became interested in new scientific ideas. Their access to these ideas was in part through natural history museums, but also through the large number of publications that were directing their arguments towards this reading public of non-professionals, but people who had a great interest in science. And this was the audience that read Darwin. The book then was a book of hard science, to be sure, but it attracted immediate, widespread popular interest. And also, of course, it sparked immediate and intense debate, first in England, where it was published, and eventually across Europe, when it was translated widely. And the debate was often formalized, the famous debate at Oxford between the Bishop of London and Thomas Huxley about exactly what constituted evolution. The bishop, of course, speaking for revealed religion, and Huxley speaking for evolution. These sorts of debates were widespread, and the conversations in clubs and the conversations around dinner tables often had to do with the kind of material that Darwin had put forth, because not only could everybody understand it, but everybody had an opinion. They felt one way or another because it affected them. It determined the nature of their own species, It determined to some extent what it meant to be human, and it also determined what science was to teach them and the role that science was to play in the broader world that they inhabited, a place that had already been determined to a degree by the success of the Industrial Revolution. Well, what was Darwin's argument? What was this revolutionary set of principles and ideas that altered the mind of an entire continent and ultimately the mind of an entire civilization? Darwin's argument was that over time, species changed, which suggested that when these forms were created, they were not immutable. In other words, they were not created in the form that we see them, but they changed. Each species developed from antecedent species. In other words, you can't create a species out of nothing. You have to have another species that would, in fact, produce them. The mechanism of change was known as natural selection, in which the struggle for the necessities of life, for food, warmth, shelter, had given certain species advantages over others. And because no two offspring of any species are identical, some slight variations proved helpful in the struggle to attain the necessities of life. For example, some species evolved with colors that camouflaged them more effectively. Others developed sharper teeth, sharper claws, stronger hind legs, or better eyes. Darwin noticed similar variations among plants, with some species able to hold fast to rocks, to feed off other plants, survive with little water. The idea of change is important, as each individual generation makes its contribution to assist in the survival of the species. And those species that fail to adapt or change will become extinct. In other words, this is a very dangerous game indeed. Either it is success or it is failure, and failure is represented in the ultimate opprobrium, that is, extinction. The implications of this, obviously, were explosive. Because they proved the book of Genesis to be a fable, they put all species, including mankind, into a natural process that was writ red in tooth and claw, as Tennyson described it. There were still those who argued that the human species developed independently, free of evolution, a privileged, divinely created being with a unique destiny and possessed of unique qualities, such as reason, speech, the soul, and so on. These individuals, some of them scientists, tried to find some measure of reconciliation between Darwin's evidence and their own religious belief, and also the role of traditional Christian values on a continent that still defined itself in those terms. So there were scientists who said, okay, what Darwin says about pigeons and dogs on the origin of species, that's fine, but they're pigeons and dogs. They have no soul, they have no speech, they have no separate being outside of their animal nature. We are humans. We have got speech, we have souls, we have reason, and so consequently we must form a category apart. And so it's fine. I'm willing to accept evolution for pigeons and dogs, but I'm not willing to accept it for human beings because we have a divine spark. We are created in God's image in order to achieve particular goals that's part of God's plan. Well, Darwin was silent on this for some time. He was aware that this controversy would arise if he, in fact, placed humans into his theory explicitly. But eventually he did. In 1871, he wrote The Descent of Man, that specifically put mankind into his theory of evolution. Critics, already hostile to the idea that the world was not created in the form we know it by the God identified in Genesis, focused their hostility on the idea that humans evolved from other primates. In fact, it is this that tends to be the point that most anti-Darwinians use as their weapon, that human beings do not fit into this category. Pope Pius IX, for example, attacked the theory with great energy. He gave his personal blessing to any faithful Roman Catholic who challenged the work. The fundamental teachings of religion, after all, identify a special place for man, either through the direct creation of man by God or the possession of special gifts. Again, speech, reason, the soul, things that differentiate us from animals. Such a belief was actually strengthened by the humanism of the Renaissance, as we've seen, that again emphasized reason and emphasized the experience of human beings on earth and the ability to use that experience in order to create some improvement in the human condition. And of course, the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment was based heavily upon concepts of human of special categories. In discovering nature's law, after all, Enlightenment thinkers believed that man's special place was made evident, since only man understood the rational, orderly, and comprehensible laws that drove the universe. The Enlightenment was very, very much a period of human exceptionalism, rational exceptionalism, and it did, in fact, put man separate from nature. There is also the issue of teleology. That is, for what purpose does the universe and those living in the universe exist? Well, everyone believes there has to be a purpose. We just don't live in a world that has no purpose or sense to it at all. There must be a purpose, and the purpose, moreover, must be good, as God is good, and God would not have created a universe not directed towards a positive end. But according to Darwin's theory of evolution, there is no longer any absolute design to nature, nor is there any single guiding principle in human development, except for the random operation of the force of natural selection, which obviously, evidently, works against the abstract principles established by the Church and even by reason, at least as illustrated in those optimistic philosophers. Even the viciously anti-clerical deist, Voltaire, and Diderot, who counseled atheism over superstition, accepted the principle of an operative, universal morality as a rational, necessary guide to a harmonious and functional society, conducive to human happiness. There must be a single morality that we all embrace, otherwise human society would begin to fragment. We must have principles that are the same, and reason will guide those principles, but we as human beings, unique among animals with reason, then must have some kind of special place. And the teleology of human existence must be good because we can apply our reason to it. Most of the rationalists, then, were willing to assign the source of this morality, however defined, to God. God was that primum mobile. He was the force that allowed this concept of absolute morality and absolute principles to operate. He provided a teleology. God's plan for man, even among the sharpest of the rationalists, was still implied in the idea that we are going to improve humanity according to reason, but for a purpose. And that purpose would necessarily be good. In other words, the kind of purpose that a divine plan would imply. But with the scientific evidence on the origin of species, survival alone, what's more, survival by any means, becomes the purpose of life. The true teleology of humanity, like all living creatures, is simply to survive and to reproduce. So what is good is what works to help a species survive and increase. That is now our teleology. Therefore, in the obvious conclusion, mankind does not control nature. Instead, nature controls man. On the origin of species disproves convincingly, then, the concept of providential design. God is irrelevant because nature operates through random choice. Indeed, it's randomness in natural selection that is so significant. There is no ordering plan, there is no teleology, there isn't anything to which we all must ascribe. It's random, and you don't know what's going to work because what will work in one environment will not work in the other. So you can't even assume that you can identify those features that will in fact allow the species to develop and progress and survive. If the variations in a species are produced randomly, then there can be no God, no force controlling the destinies of all living things. If the universe has no order, then whatever succeeds is right and proper, with no need for or reference to morality of any kind or a higher being. It is nature, then, that identifies the strong and eliminates the weak. Those species that die out are biologically failed experiments. Of course, this moves against that Newtonian idea of a wonderfully balanced, elegant universe that is put together according to principles that can ultimately be understood. With Darwin, those principles now become irrelevant because what is understood is only what works and what we can see actually functioning. And what's more, we cannot predict how the future is going to develop. So we have no general principles. We have no absolute morality. What we have is the need to survive. With the origin of species and the descent of man, mankind then has rejoined nature. And rather than being a privileged creature, we're part of the same world as any other animal. And we're subject to the same natural forces. Consequently, the world becomes a dangerous place. It's dangerous for animals, clearly, because if they don't adapt appropriately, they're going to become extinct, and if they're too slow, they end up as lunch. Well, human beings are now in exactly that category. It's a violent game where survival or extinction is the only consequence of success or failure. Evolution and natural selection, subsequently referred to as survival of the fittest. The term isn't Darwin's, by the way. It's Darwin's apologist, Herbert Spencer, whom we'll meet in the next lecture. The idea of survival of the fittest was thus part of the human development, our development as a species. And it could be argued the most important part, because when discussing human society in the 19th century, it was believed that the stakes were highest. That is, animals have only the most marginal control over their environments, whereas science and technology have given mankind significant influence over his. Perhaps new principles are needed. New principles to take advantage of this new knowledge, which science, through Darwin, had revealed. Ideas which not only accepted, but in many instances celebrated human characteristics that for millennia had been defined as equal, that had been defined as evil, according to religious or moral principles. And when put in this category of defense and the need to expand at the expense of neighbors, the need to ensure that it is your offspring that will survive to have children of their own, you begin then to look at the sorts of ideas that began to corrode the 19th century sense of optimism and then direct Europe towards the Armageddon that would be the First World War. Militarism, war, imperialism, uncontrollable competition in business, apathy, or even open hostility towards the poor and the weak, supremacist racial theory. All of these things clearly predated Darwinism. All of them had been discussed in one form or another almost from the beginning of recorded history. Now, however, it is a completely different context. Darwin gave these ideas new life because he turned these things into an element that was part of science, part of nature, that the expansion of nations was in fact part of the survival of the fittest. The complete lack of concern for the poor and the sick was in fact necessary so as not to degenerate the race. These attitudes, which were so despicable in the liberal perspective and the charitable world of our taking care of our fellow humans, now in fact become things that can be identified as positive, as being beneficial to the race, as being beneficial to the group. Darwin, that gentle, scholarly, sensitive hypochondriac of Downhouse, believed in none of these things. Darwin was anything but a monster. He, in fact, was the dear grandfather that you would adore. But at the same time, he was a scientist who believed evidence, and he believed that the evidence had to be made manifest. Others took his ideas and put them in different contexts, but Darwin himself always stood behind the conclusions that he had reached. Darwin hadn't intended in any way whatsoever for his book on the origin of species to be used for the purposes of militarism, racial theory, and so on. But others applied Darwinism to these kinds of social questions, and this would lead to the evolution of what became known as social Darwinism, one of the more pernicious ideologies to arise from 19th century scientism in industrial society in Europe, and one which would in turn breed even more horrific ideas and practices, because they would put ideas that were horrible in themselves and practiced only with embarrassment into the realm of something that was scientifically justifiable, something that in fact you could say almost with pride. It provided an ideology that endangered European civilization itself. This is not Charles Darwin's fault at all. It's not the fault of On the Origin of Species. It's the fault of people who take scientific principles from one context and apply them in the social, political, and economic context of another. And that will be the subject of our next lecture when we look at social Darwinism and how these principles were applied to the human condition.